The weathered mountain man counted his last quarter, raised his trembling hand at the town auction, and bought the broken cabin for 25 cents. But what he found inside would be worth $5 million. The crowd erupted in cruel laughter. Fools throwing away good money on kindling. They saw a desperate outcast destined to freeze come winter, too stubborn to accept charity, too proud to leave town. But hidden in that cabin's shadows lived a trembling girl whose father had died protecting documents that could reshape the entire territory. The railroad men who killed him believed those papers burned with everything else. Now the mountain man must choose between claiming a fortune that could save his life or protecting secrets that could destroy the most powerful men in Colorado. Will he take the wealth and run, or risk everything for a child who holds the key to justice itself? Before we continue, comment where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will publish a story there. The mountain wind cut through Wyatt Freeman's threadbare coat as he crouched beside his makeshift shelter. 3 weeks until the first snow, maybe less. The canvas walls flapped against the wooden frame he'd cobbled together from fallen branches and salvaged lumber. He counted the coins in his weathered palm. 27 cents. Not enough for a room at the boarding house. Not enough for much of anything in Silver Rock, Colorado Territory. The town below sprawled along the valley floor like a scar on the landscape. Smoke rose from chimneys. Warm light glowed through windows. People moved between buildings without glancing up at the mountainside where he'd made his camp. Wyatt pulled his old cavalry jacket tighter. The blue wool had faded to gray, but the fabric still held against the wind. He'd worn it during his years as a buffalo soldier. Back when he had purpose. Back when he had a place. That was before the drought took his farm. Before the bank took what little remained. Before he'd loaded his few possessions onto a mule and headed west, looking for work that never came. The people of Silver Rock made their feelings clear. Shop owners watched him with suspicion. The saloon keeper refused his business. Even the general store owner counted change twice when Wyatt bought supplies. Only Reverend Lancaster treated him with basic courtesy. The preacher nodded when they passed on the street. Sometimes he left food near Wyatt's camp with no explanation. Tomorrow was auction day. The town gathered monthly to sell unclaimed property and settle debts. Wyatt had attended twice, watching from the edges of the crowd, listening, learning what he could afford with his dwindling coins. He'd heard about the cabin. Everyone had. Miguel Delgado's place sat empty since the railroad accident. The man had owed money to half the town. His property would go cheap. Wyatt studied the structure through his father's old spyglass. The roof looked solid. The walls stood straight. The chimney showed no cracks. It wasn't the palace the townspeople claimed to deserve, but it would keep him alive through winter. The next morning, he walked down the mountain path into Silver Rock. His boots crunched on fallen leaves. His breath misted in the cold air. The town square buzzed with activity. Families clustered around tables displaying household goods. Men examined farming tools and saddles. Children darted between their parents' legs. Wyatt kept to the outer ring of the crowd. He recognized most faces by now. There was Sheriff Carnes, his badge catching the morning sun. Miss Clara Hart stood near the schoolhouse, watching the proceedings with intelligent eyes. A well-dressed stranger in a city coat moved through the crowd, studying everything with calculating attention. Auctioneer Jackson climbed onto his wooden platform. He banged his gavel against a block of wood. The bidding began. With valuable items, a plow sold for $8. A matched pair of draft horses brought $23. The crowd grew animated as prices climbed. Then came the smaller lots. Kitchen implements, worn furniture, tools with broken handles. Finally, Jackson gestured toward the edge of town. Miguel Delgado's cabin. As is, where is. Structure needs work. Property taxes owed. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Someone laughed. Another person shook their head. What am I bid? Do I hear $5? Silence. $3? More silence. People shifted their feet. A woman whispered something to her husband. $1 then. Surely someone needs the lumber. The well-dressed stranger watched intently. Sheriff Carnes glanced his way, then back at the crowd. Wyatt's heart hammered. This was his chance, his only chance. 25 cents, Jackson said with a theatrical sigh. Just to cover the paperwork. Anyone? Wyatt raised his hand. The crowd turned. Faces registered surprise, then amusement. Someone snickered. Another person nudged his neighbor. Well, I'll be, Jackson said. Going once to the gentleman for 25 cents. He's throwing good money after bad, a voice called out. Won't last a week up there, another added. Jackson banged his gavel. Sold. Laughter rippled through the crowd as people began to disperse. Wyatt walked to the platform and placed his quarter in Jackson's palm. The auctioneer handed him a simple deed and a rusty key. Good luck, he said. His tone suggested Wyatt would need it. The walk to the cabin took 30 minutes. Wyatt followed the dirt road past the last houses, then up a gentle slope covered with pine trees. The building sat in a small clearing, surrounded by wild grass and scattered boulders. Up close, the structure looked better than he'd hoped. The previous owner had maintained it well. The door hung straight on its hinges. The windows still held glass. A small port mechanism clicked. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. Dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight. The main room held a stone fireplace, a wooden table, 2 chairs. A ladder led to a loft space under the peaked roof. He walked through the cabin, testing floorboards with his weight. Most felt secure. A few creaked and sagged slightly. Nothing he couldn't repair. This would work. This would keep him alive. Outside, storm clouds gathered over the mountain peaks. Winter was coming, but Wyatt Freeman finally had shelter. He had no idea that in the loft above, a pair of frightened eyes watched his every move. Wyatt spent his first week making the cabin livable. He patched holes in the roof with bark and clay. He cleared debris from the chimney. He reinforced loose boards with salvaged nails. The work felt good. Purpose flowed through his hands as he shaped wood and stone. This was his place now, his sanctuary against the coming winter. On the 8th day, he noticed something odd. A section of floorboards near the fireplace sagged more than the others. The wood had a different grain pattern. Newer nails held these boards in place. Wyatt knelt and examined the area closely. Scratch marks scored the wood around the edges. Someone had pried up these boards recently. He worked his knife blade into the gap and lifted. The boards came up easily, revealing a rectangular cavity beneath. Inside sat an ornate wooden chest with Spanish engravings along its edges. His breath caught. The chest was heavy, substantial, the kind of container meant to protect valuable items. Wyatt lifted it from its hiding place and set it on the table. The lock had been broken long ago. He opened the lid. Documents filled the chest. Land deeds written in Spanish and English. Mining rights certificates. Railroad contracts with official seals. Letters bearing government stamps. He spread the papers across the table, studying each one carefully. The name Delgado appeared repeatedly. Don Carlos Delgado. Miguel Delgado. Dates going back 40 years. A soft sound came from above. Wyatt froze. He'd heard something similar over the past few days, but assumed it was mice or wind. This sound was different, deliberate. He moved to the base of the ladder and looked up. Anyone there? Silence. I know someone's up there. Come down. I won't hurt you. More silence. Then a shuffling noise. Bare feet appeared on the ladder rungs. Thin legs. A girl descended slowly, her back pressed against the ladder. She couldn't be more than 14 years old. Her dark hair hung in tangles around her face. Her clothes were dirty and torn. She looked like she hadn't eaten in days. She reached the bottom rung and turned to face him. Her eyes held the wariness of a cornered animal. "What's your name?" Wyatt asked gently. Elena. Her voice was barely a whisper. Another nod. Your father was Miguel? Yes. Tears gathered in her eyes. He died 3 weeks ago. Railroad accident, they said. But I know better. Wyatt pulled out a chair. Sit. Tell me what happened. Elena remained standing, ready to bolt. Papa owned this cabin, owned lots of land, but men came with papers saying he owed money. Papa said the papers were lies. She wiped her nose with her sleeve. Papa hid the chest before they came back, said if something happened to him, I should protect it, said it proved everything. What does it prove? That we own the land, that my grandfather owned thousands of acres before the Americans came, that the railroad stole it all. Wyatt picked up one of the deeds. The Spanish text was difficult to read, but the English translation was clear. Don Carlos Delgado had owned vast territories in what was now Colorado. Your grandfather was wealthy? Very wealthy. He had silver mines, cattle ranches. When the territory changed hands, American officials said his papers weren't valid anymore, said he had to prove ownership in American courts. Elena's voice grew stronger as she spoke. Grandfather tried to follow their laws, but every time he went to court, something went wrong. Witnesses disappeared, documents got lost. Officials claimed they never received his filings. What happened to him? Died of a broken heart. Lost everything except this cabin and a few acres around it. Papa inherited what was left. Wyatt studied the railroad contracts. They showed systematic purchases of Mexican-owned land at prices far below market value. Many bore the signature of someone named Silas Crowley. The men who came to see your father, what did they look like? One was Sheriff Carnes. The other was a stranger in a fancy coat, city man. They offered Papa money for the documents. When he refused, they said he'd be sorry. The pieces fell into place. Wyatt remembered the well-dressed stranger at the auction, the calculating way he'd watched the proceedings. Papa died 2 days later, Elena continued. They said a beam fell on him at the railroad yard. But Papa was careful. He knew about dangerous work. Why didn't you go to someone? The reverend? The school teacher? Who would believe me? I'm just a Mexican girl with no family. They'd put me in an orphanage, or worse. Elena looked at the documents scattered across the table. Those papers prove my family's right to the land. But they also prove the railroad stole it. Men have killed to keep that secret. Wyatt felt the weight of the moment. These documents could make him wealthy beyond imagination. The mining rights alone were worth a fortune. He could claim legal ownership of the cabin and everything inside it. But looking at Elena's thin face and desperate eyes, he saw something else. He saw himself 20 years ago. Elena's shoulders straightened. I want justice. For Papa. For Grandfather. For all the families they destroyed. That's dangerous. These men have killed before. I know, but hiding won't bring Papa back, and someday they'll find me anyway. Wyatt made his decision. Then we'll fight them, together. For the first time since he'd met her, Elena smiled. Outside, storm clouds gathered over the mountains, and in town, Silas Crowley was beginning to wonder what the old mountain man had found in that cabin. Wyatt studied Elena's face in the lamplight. The girl had steel beneath her fear. He recognized that quality from his military days. Some people broke under pressure. Others found strength they never knew they possessed. Tell me about the other families, he said. Elena counted on her fingers. The Herreras lost their ranch 2 years ago. The Sandovals gave up their mining claim last spring. The Morettis sold their land for almost nothing after their oldest son had an accident. A pattern emerged. Families pressured to sell. Convenient accidents. Official documents that disappeared or got rejected by courts. We need allies, Wyatt said. People in town who might listen. Most folks are scared of the railroad. It brings jobs and money. But not everyone. Elena nodded slowly. Reverend Lancaster helped Papa once, gave him food when times were hard. And Miss Hart, the school teacher, she's always been kind to Mexican children. The next morning, Wyatt walked into town. He found Reverend Lancaster sweeping the church steps. "Reverend." Lancaster looked up. "Mr. Freeman, how are you settling in?" "Well enough. I wonder if we might talk privately." The Reverend glanced around, then gestured toward the church interior. They settled in a back pew. "I've learned some disturbing things," Wyatt began, "about how certain families have been treated in this town." Lancaster's expression grew cautious. "What kind of things?" "Land taken through questionable means, families forced to sell under pressure." "That's a serious accusation." Wyatt studied the older man's face. "You've seen it happen, haven't you?" A long pause. Then Lancaster nodded. "Miguel Delgado came to me before he died, said men were threatening him, wanted him to sell documents that proved his family's land ownership." "What did you tell him?" "To be careful, to trust in God's justice." Lancaster's voice carried regret. "Perhaps I should have done more." "You can do more now." Wyatt explained about Elena and the hidden documents, about the systematic pattern of land theft, about the connection to railroad interests. Lancaster listened without interruption. When Wyatt finished, the Reverend sat quietly for several minutes. "The girl needs protection," Lancaster finally said. "Bring her here. I'll arrange temporary shelter." "With whom?" Schoolteacher was a woman in her 30s with intelligent eyes and calloused hands. "Reverend Lancaster explained your situation," she told Elena. "You're welcome to stay as long as needed." Elena looked uncertain. "I don't want to bring trouble." "Child, trouble is already here. The question is whether we face it or pretend it doesn't exist." Over the next 3 days, they developed a plan. Miss Hart would research courthouse records during her free time. Reverend Lancaster would quietly contact other affected families. Wyatt would organize the information and documents. Elena proved surprisingly knowledgeable about local history. She remembered stories her father and grandfather had told about land ownership, mining claims, and early territorial law. "Grandfather always said the Americans used different legal systems to confuse people," she explained. "Spanish land grants versus territorial deeds, mining claims versus surface rights. They made it so complicated that honest people gave up trying to fight." Miss Hart returned from the courthouse with disturbing news. "Half the records from the 1850s and 1860s are missing. The clerk said there was a fire 10 years ago, but other people told me the documents just disappeared one day." "Convenient fire," Wyatt observed. "Very convenient. But I did find some interesting information about recent land sales. Most were handled by the same lawyer. Most involved the same railroad company. And most happened right after the original owners had accidents or sudden financial problems." Reverend Lancaster brought even more troubling reports. "I spoke with Maria Herrera. She confirmed that her husband was pressured to sell their ranch. Said a man in a city coat made threats about their children's safety." "Crowley?" "She thinks so. Matches the description." "What about the Sandovals?" "They left town after selling their mining claim. No forwarding address. Neighbors said they seemed frightened." That evening, Wyatt sat in the cabin studying the documents by lamplight. The evidence painted a clear picture of systematic theft. But evidence meant nothing without legal recourse. And legal recourse required honest officials. A sound outside made him look up. Footsteps approached the cabin. Wyatt moved to the window. A well-dressed figure stood in the clearing. Even in the darkness, the man's expensive coat and confident posture marked him as the stranger from the auction. A knock came at the door. Wyatt opened it. The man was younger than expected, maybe 40 years old, with sharp features and calculating eyes. "Mr. Freeman? My name is Silas Crowley. I represent certain business interests in the territory." "What can I do for you, Mr. Crowley?" "I understand you've been asking questions around town, about land ownership and such." "I ask questions about many things," Crowley smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. I also understand you might have come across certain documents, historical, papers, of questionable authenticity. Don't know what you mean. Of course not. But if such documents existed, and if someone wanted to dispose of them, I'd be prepared to offer fair compensation. How fair? $500, cash money. More than enough to set up a man comfortably through several winters. Wyatt considered the offer. $500 was more money than he'd seen in years. Enough to buy proper land, build a real house, maybe even start the farm he'd always dreamed of. But then he thought about Elena's tears when she spoke of her father, about the families driven from their homes, about the systematic corruption that had destroyed so many lives. "I'll think about it," he said. Crowley's smile grew wider. "Don't think too long, Mr. Freeman. Winter's coming, and a man can freeze to death up here if he's not careful." The threat hung in the air between them. "I'll be in touch," Crowley said, and walked back into the darkness. Wyatt closed the door and barred it. The battle lines were now clearly drawn. The next morning brought unwelcome visitors to town. 3 men in dusty coats rode in with Crowley. They took rooms at the boarding house and made their presence known on every street corner. Wyatt watched from the general store as one of them questioned merchants about his recent purchases. Another loitered near the church, observing everyone who came and went. The third kept vigil outside Miss Hart's house. "They're not being subtle," Miss Hart observed when they met that evening at the Reverend's house. "They don't need to be," Wyatt replied. "Fear works better when it's obvious." Elena had been unusually quiet all day. Now she spoke up from her corner chair. "I remember these men. They came with Crowley to see Papa. Are you certain? The tall one has a scar on his left hand. The short one limps when he walks. I watched them from the window that day." Reverend Lancaster poured coffee for the group. "What's our next step?" "We need more evidence," Wyatt said, "and we need to document everything we have before something happens to it." Miss Hart had been busy at the courthouse despite the missing records. "I found something interesting in the tax rolls. The same properties keep getting reassessed at higher values right before their owners sell. Almost like someone knew the assessments were coming." "Who handles tax assessments?" "Sheriff Carnes signs off on all of them." Wyatt wasn't surprised. He'd suspected Carnes was involved from the beginning. "What about the county clerk?" "Old man Peterson. Been in the job for 20 years. Seems honest, but he's also scared. Kept looking over his shoulder while I was there." Elena had been studying the documents again. Her young mind caught details the adults missed. "Look at these signatures," she said, pointing to several railroad contracts. "They're supposed to be from different people, but closely." Elena was right. The signatures on contracts supposedly signed months apart by different landowners showed identical pen strokes and letter formations. "Forgeries," he said. "More than that," Miss Hart added. "I compared these signatures to ones in the courthouse records. They don't match the real owner's signatures on earlier documents." The evidence was mounting, but so was the danger. That night, someone threw rocks at Miss Hart's windows. The next day, Reverend Lancaster found his church door pried open, though nothing was missing. "They're sending a message," Wyatt told Elena as they walked back to the cabin. "Letting us know they can reach anyone, anywhere." "Are you scared?" she asked. Wyatt considered the question honestly. "Yes. But being scared and being stopped are different things." They reached the cabin as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. Wyatt lit a lamp and began reviewing the documents again. His military training had taught him the importance of preparation. Know your enemy. Know your resources. Plan for multiple outcomes. A soft knock came at the door. Wyatt grabbed the rifle from above the fireplace and motioned for Elena to hide behind the table. "Who's there?" "Sheriff Carnes. Need to talk to you, Freeman." Wyatt opened the door but kept the rifle ready. Carnes stood alone, his badge glinting in the lamplight. "Evening, Sheriff. Mind if I come in?" "Depends on what you want to discuss." Carnes stepped inside without waiting for permission. His eyes swept the room, taking in the scattered documents on the table. "Heard you've been stirring up trouble in town." "Just asking questions." "Sometimes questions can be dangerous, especially when they involve powerful people." Wyatt watched the sheriff's face carefully. "What kind of people?" "The kind that bring jobs and prosperity to communities. The kind that don't appreciate outsiders making accusations." "What accusations would those be?" Carnes moved closer to the table. "You know what I'm talking about. These old papers don't mean anything anymore. Territories change hands. Laws change. Smart people adapt. And the people who don't adapt? They find life gets difficult. Accidents happen. Businesses fail. Sometimes folks just decide it's better to move somewhere else." The threat was clear. Wyatt kept his expression neutral. "Sounds like you speak from experience." "I keep the peace in this town, whatever that requires." Carnes picked up one of the documents and examined it. "Funny thing about old papers, they burn real easy. House fires are common in winter, especially in cabins with old chimneys. This chimney's in good repair. Things can change fast in the mountains." Elena remained hidden, but Wyatt could sense her tension. He needed to end this conversation before it escalated. "Who's been staying with the school teacher? Heard she might be in the territory illegally." "Federal marshals take a dim view of that kind of thing." After Carnes left, Elena emerged from her hiding spot. Her face was pale but determined. "He knows," she said. "He's been working with Crowley from the beginning. Probably gets paid for every family that gives up and leaves." "What do we do now?" Wyatt looked at the documents spread across the table. Their evidence was solid, but they needed someone in authority who wasn't corrupted. Someone beyond Crowley's reach. "We need to get word to Denver. The territorial government, maybe even Washington." "How?" "I'm still working on that part." Outside, wind howled through the pine trees. Storm clouds gathered over the mountains, and in the distance, orange light flickered where it shouldn't be. Someone had set a fire on the mountainside, close enough to send a message, but far enough away to avoid real damage. Yet, the warning was clear. Next time, they might not be so fortunate. Elena couldn't sleep. She sat by the window in Miss Hart's spare room, staring at the cabin on the mountainside. Something felt wrong. The night was too quiet. At 2 a.m, she saw the orange glow. She dressed quickly and slipped out of the house. The path to the cabin was treacherous in darkness, but she'd walked it many times. Her bare feet found purchase on familiar rocks and roots. The smell of smoke grew stronger as she climbed. Not the clean scent of a fireplace, but the harsh odor of burning wood and kerosene. She crested the ridge and saw flames licking at the cabin's walls. Dark figures moved around the structure, throwing torches through broken windows. Elena's heart hammered. Wyatt was inside. She cupped her hands around her mouth and screamed his name. The sound echoed across the mountainside. One of the arsonists turned toward her voice. In the firelight, she recognized Sheriff Carnes. He shouted something to the other men and started up the slope toward her. Movement at the cabin's back door caught her attention. Wyatt emerged, coughing and stumbling. He carried something in his arms. The document chest. Elena ran toward him, staying ahead of Carnes in the darkness. She knew these mountains better than any of them. "This way," she called, leading Wyatt down a game trail that wound between the trees. Behind them, Carnes cursed as he crashed through underbrush. The other men had joined the pursuit, their voices carrying through the night air. Elena led Wyatt to a small cave she'd discovered as a child. They crawled inside and pressed themselves against the back wall. The sounds of pursuit faded. Their enemies had lost the trail in the darkness. "Are you hurt?" Elena whispered. "Smoke got my lungs, but I'm alive, thanks to you." Wyatt opened the chest. Most of the document ones. "I think so, but Elena, I have to tell you something. While I was gathering these papers, I found something else hidden in the loft." He pulled out a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were letters addressed to Miguel Delgado. Elena's breath caught as Wyatt unfolded the first letter. It was from a railroad supervisor, dated 3 weeks before her father's death. "Your father didn't die in an accident," Wyatt said gently. "This letter talks about eliminating problems that might interfere with land acquisition." Elena read the words herself. The language was careful, but the meaning was clear. Miguel Delgado had been murdered because he refused to sell the documents. "There's more," Wyatt continued. "Sheriff Carnes signed a report the next day claiming your father was drunk when the beam fell. But this letter mentions a meeting between Carnes and the railroad supervisor that same morning." The final piece of the conspiracy fell into place. Elena's father had been killed on orders from the railroad company, and Carnes had covered up the murder. "We have them now," Elena said, her voice hard with determination. "This proves everything. If we can get it to honest authorities. But Carnes will search every building in town. We need somewhere safe to hide until we can reach Denver." Elena thought about the families who'd been driven away, the lies that had been told, the lives that had been destroyed. Her father's death hadn't been random bad luck. It had been murder, planned and executed by men who thought they were above justice. "I know a place," she said. "There's an abandoned mine shaft 2 miles north. Papa showed it to me once, said it connected to a whole network of tunnels." They spent the rest of the night in the cave, waiting for dawn. When the sun rose, they could see smoke still rising from the cabin's ruins. The trek to the mine took most of the morning. Elena led them along deer paths and ridge lines, staying away from roads where Carnes' men might spot them. The mine entrance was partially collapsed, but Elena squeezed through a gap in the fallen timbers. Wyatt followed, pulling the document chest behind him. Inside, the tunnel stretched into darkness. Old mining equipment lay scattered on the ground. The air smelled of dust and dampness, but it was dry enough to protect the papers. "How long can we stay here?" Wyatt asked. "As long as we need to. There's a spring deeper in the tunnel, and I cached some food here after Papa died." They spent the day organizing the surviving documents. The evidence was overwhelming. Land deeds, mining rights, railroad contracts, and now the letters proving Miguel's murder. "We need to get word to someone in Denver," Wyatt said, "someone who can act on this information." Miss Hart mentioned a territorial judge who's been investigating railroad corruption, Judge Morrison. "How do we reach him?" Elena smiled about this mine. "There are other tunnels that come out near the main road. We can get a message to the stagecoach station without going through town." That evening, they made their move. Elena guided Wyatt through the tunnel system to an exit point 3 miles from Silver Rock. They flagged down the Denver stage and convinced the driver to carry a letter to Judge Morrison. The message was simple: evidence of murder and land fraud in Silver Rock. Federal investigation needed immediately, documents and witnesses available. They signed it with both their names and included detailed directions to the mine. Back in their underground hideout, they settled in to wait. It would take at least a week for the judge to receive their message and respond. "Do you think he'll come?" Elena asked. "If he's the honest man Miss Hart believes he is, yes. And if he's not?" Wyatt looked at the girl who'd risked everything for justice. "Then we'll find another way. Your father died for these documents. We're not giving up now." Outside, Carnes and his men searched every building in Silver Rock, but their quarry had vanished into the mountains like ghosts. Judge Morrison arrived in Silver Rock on a cold Tuesday morning with 2 federal marshals and a stenographer. Word spread quickly through town that territorial officials were investigating local affairs. Crowley tried to leave on the first stage out, but the marshals stopped him at the station. His expensive coat and confident manner meant nothing to federal law enforcement. Wyatt and Elena emerged from the mine tunnels to find the town in chaos. Sheriff Carnes had barricaded himself in his office. His 3 hired men had vanished during the night. Miss Hart met them at the church, tears streaming down her face. "I thought you were dead. Everyone said the cabin fire killed you both." "Close," Wyatt replied, "but Elena saved us." Reverend Lancaster embraced them both. "Judge Morrison wants to see you immediately. He's set up a temporary court in the town hall." They walked through streets filled with nervous residents. Some people nodded supportively. Others avoided eye contact entirely. The railroad's influence had divided the community for years. Judge Morrison was a stern man in his 50s with gray hair and penetrating eyes. He examined the documents spread across a long table while his stenographer recorded everything. "These land deeds appear authentic," he said. "The Spanish land grants have proper seals and signatures. The territorial surveys match courthouse records from the 1850s. Elena stood beside Wyatt, her chin raised defiantly. "My grandfather owned all this land legally. The railroad stole it through lies and intimidation." "What about your father's death? You claim it wasn't an accident?" Wyatt handed over the letters they'd found in the loft. "These prove Miguel Delgado was murdered on—" Read the correspondence carefully. His expression grew darker with each page. "This evidence suggests a conspiracy involving fraud, murder, and corruption of local officials." "There's more," Elena said. "Other families were driven away through similar methods. The Herreras, the Sandovals, the Morettis." "Can you produce witnesses?" Reverend Lancaster stepped forward. "Judge, many of those families left the territory in fear, but some people remain who can testify about what they saw." Over the next 3 days, the temporary court heard testimony from dozens of witnesses. Maria Herrera had stayed in Colorado and traveled 2 days to testify about threats made against her family. The county clerk, Peterson, admitted under oath that he'd been pressured to lose certain documents. Most damaging of all, Sheriff Carnes broke down on the witness stand. Faced with federal murder charges, he confessed to taking bribes and covering up Miguel's death. "Crowley paid me $500 to rule it an accident," he sobbed. "Said it was just business. Said nobody would care about one Mexican worker." "Did you know they planned to kill him?" "I knew something bad was going to happen. I should have warned him. I should have stopped it." Crowley's lawyer tried to discredit the evidence, claiming the documents were forgeries and the witnesses were lying. But the overwhelming pattern of testimony made his case impossible. On Friday morning, Judge Morrison delivered his ruling. "This court finds that Elena Delgado is the rightful heir to the lands described in these documents. The Spanish land grants were legitimate and remain valid under territorial law." Elena gripped Wyatt's hand as the judge continued. "Furthermore, this court finds evidence of criminal conspiracy involving fraud, murder, and corruption. Silas Crowley and Sheriff Bradley Carnes will be held for trial on federal charges." The courtroom erupted in cheers from some spectators and angry shouts from others. The marshals had to restore order, but Judge Morrison wasn't finished. "Miss Delgado, you now own approximately 12,000 acres of land, including mineral rights to proven silver deposits. Conservative estimates suggest a value of $5 million in current currency." Elena stared at him in shock. She'd known the land was valuable, but the actual number overwhelmed her. "However," the judge continued, "you are still a minor child. The court requires appointment of a legal guardian to manage your affairs until you reach majority age." Elena looked at Wyatt with pleading eyes. "I choose Mr. Freeman as my guardian." "Mr. Freeman, Do you accept this responsibility? Wyatt thought about his journey from desperate mountain man to guardian of a fortune. I accept, Your Honor, but I want it recorded that any decisions about this land will be made with Elena's wishes in mind. So ordered. The legal proceedings concluded, but the real work was just beginning. Elena insisted on using part of her wealth to establish a fund for other displaced families. She wanted to build a school and a community center in Silver Rock. Papa always said education was the only thing they couldn't steal from you, she explained. Wyatt helped her navigate the complex world of land management and business dealings. His military experience with logistics and planning proved invaluable. They rebuilt the cabin together, making it larger and more comfortable. It became their family home and the headquarters for Elena's charitable foundation. Miss Hart became the head teacher at Elena's new school. Reverend Lancaster expanded his church to accommodate the growing community. Even some of the families who'd been driven away returned when they heard about the changes. On a warm evening in late spring, Wyatt and Elena sat on their new porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. The town below bustled with honest activity. Children played in streets that had once been filled with fear. "Do you ever regret spending that quarter on the cabin?" Elena asked. Wyatt smiled at the girl who'd become his granddaughter in all but blood. "Best investment I ever made." Elena leaned against his shoulder. "Grandfather, what should we do with all this money?" "Whatever you think your father would have wanted. He would have wanted justice, and family, and a place where people could build good lives without fear. Then, that's what we'll build." As stars appeared overhead, they planned their future together, surrounded by a community that had learned the true value of standing up for what was right.